Welcome in to another episode of the Barnes on Bama podcast. I'm your host, Owen Barnes, and we have a couple of games to discuss. First off, really sorry that I missed the episode breaking down the Creighton game. I was under the weather and had a trip last weekend and just really was not feeling well when I got back this week. So my voice was just shot and I wasn't able to record, so really sorry about that. If you do follow me over on Twitter, I was able to put out the pregame thread as I always do, breaking down the game and giving my prediction. The game was a slightly lower scoring game than I had anticipated. I had projected 88-75. Alabama ends up winning 83-75. We'll break that down here very shortly. But as I mentioned, really sorry about that. Just a little bit of a heads up as to the record schedule. I'm going to record this episode giving a breakdown of that Creighton game, as I mentioned, as well as a bit of a recap to the North Dakota game. But I will say that the recap for the North Dakota game is also going to be a bit of a recap for the Kent State and South Dakota State game, right? It's just going to be what I think that the Alabama basketball team needs to do as we go in and get through the end of non-conference slate, right? So that's really going to be what do I think about those games. I'm probably not going to have time to do actual breakdowns of each of those games just due to travel over the holidays and things that I have planned. I do plan to try to record an episode ahead of that Oklahoma game on January the 4th. I'm going to have to record while I'm at home. I do have a wedding that I'm going to be at on that day. But like I said, I'm going to try to get an episode out before that Oklahoma game, if at all possible. So thank you so much, everybody, staying with me through the holiday season. I know it's a little bit different as it comes to record schedule. When we get into the full swing of conference slate, expect there to be 2 episodes a week. One giving a breakdown of the games before and one giving a recap of the games prior. Some weeks there may just be 1 episode if the game schedule allows it, but I will make sure that there's an episode breaking down and recapping every game, especially when we get into the conference slate. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching, and subscribe to the channel for more if you are interested. So let's get right into that Creighton game, and we will discuss. As I mentioned, for those of you that followed me over on Twitter, I did do a pregame thread for this game in the absence of the breakdown. Sorry about that. But Alabama ends up winning this game 83-75. And there was quite a few takeaways you could take away from this game. I think the biggest one is that Alabama did not shoot well, but still beats a pretty good team by 8 points, right? You know, I mentioned in the thread that I thought that the problem was going to be Creighton was missing Pop Isaacs, and that was going to be a major problem. I just was not sure how they were going to get the scoring, right? However, if this was the Alabama team of last season, our defense was so poor that it wouldn't have mattered, right? If this was a team that just had super lackluster defense, no intensity, I think Creighton still could have won this game because of how poorly Alabama shot. The difference in this team and last season's team is there was that level of defensive intensity, especially on individual efforts. We'll talk about some of them here in a second, but the ones I want to highlight kind of off the top were Cliff Amore was great fronting the post, trying to keep the ball out of Ryan Kalkbrenner's hands. Kalkbrenner still had a pretty good game, but in general, they were not able to feed him as much as they were last season. Kalkbrenner really was the difference in the game in Omaha last season, and Creighton was not able to have as much success, partially due to Cliff Amore and partially also due to Grant Nelson. Grant Nelson did not score great in this game, but did have a fairly decent defensive effort and tied for the lead in plus-minus, right? So what he didn't do on the offensive end, he did make up for on the defensive end. I thought that by and large, both of those guys did a pretty good job on Ryan Kalkbrenner. He's one of the best players in the country, so you're never going to stop him completely. But they were able to keep the ball out of his hands as much as humanly possible. But the guys from the individual effort on a defensive standpoint that I think that really need to be highlighted is LeBaron Fowler and Darion Reed, right? The 2 freshmen. And I thought that this game for both of those guys was a great game. LeBaron Fowler gets 2 steals, kind of does a little bit of everything, has 16 points, 7 of 8 from the field. Didn't shoot well from 3, but really nobody on the team, not named Mark Sears, did. Was decent on the rebounding end, getting 5 rebounds, had a couple of assists. LeBaron Fowler, if you've not seen or heard, anybody talk about him this season, just know that if you want to see him play basketball, you better watch a game this season. He will not be in an Alabama uniform next season. I think that is kind of a foregone conclusion at this point. Him and Darion Reed both will be one and dones. Just their defensive and offensive abilities. Darion Reed definitely has a higher defensive ceiling than LeBaron Philon. LeBaron Philon's a little bit more polished on the offensive end currently. But both of those guys, I think, will be gone after this season. Philon's kind of been the surprise of the season. Was really more of a surprise coming into the offseason than when he got on campus. All the stuff you heard out of practice was Philon is the real deal, and he is really, really good on the two-way, and it really shows and jumps off the screen, especially in a game like Creighton when he's able to have a little bit of flow, right? He did have a couple of turnovers, or he did have quite a few turnovers in this game. I thought that some of those were unforced, maybe not as much as you would want. Typically, LeBaron's pretty good with the ball, so that was a little bit uncommon for him. I don't expect him to have 4 turnovers in most games, but I thought that in general, LeBaron Philon was exactly what you need him to be. He was a spark plug on both ends of the floor. He got into Stephen Ashworth's head a little bit. I know Ashworth was pretty good overall. He had 9 assists. He was really the only person that could facilitate the offense for Creighton. There was a moment in which McDermott took him out because Ashworth got his 4th foul and almost immediately had to put him back in because their offense just could not move at all with Ashworth on the bench, right? And I thought LeBaron was one of the better defenders when it came to defending Ashworth. I know Darion Reed also did a good job from that standpoint, but in general, I thought both of those guys did a really good job. The thing about Darion that I'll say also is he had 2 offensive rebounds in this game, and I thought that the offensive rebounds, if you read my write-up thread, I thought that the glass was a spot that we were going to have a lot of success. It's the one spot on a KenPom chart or an Evan Maya chart that kind of jumps off the screen for you with Creighton. Is they're a really bad offensive rebounding team. And typically those teams that are pretty bad offensive rebounding, even if they're decent defensive rebounding teams, if you are a elite rebounding team and you preach it at the level that Nate Oates does, you can have success against those teams, right? It's a nature thing. It's the reason why Houston's always so good at rebounding, right? If that's all you preach, then you're going to be good at it down the line. And it clearly is just not something that's like the stalwart of a Creighton team. Creighton, defend without fouling, a few other things that you could say, hey, this is what Creighton basketball is. But being a lead on the glass is not one of those. And Alabama did just that, right? Alabama dominated the glass in this game. Alabama gets 17 offensive rebounds, and I thought Darion Reed was a big piece of that, right? Whether it was the box outs, he did have 2 offensive rebounds himself as well as a couple of putbacks. I thought that just in general, Darion played a really good game. 21 minutes, 12 points. Like I said, in general, I thought that it was a very successful game for Darion. He had a pretty flashy dunk as well when Chris Youngblood, who we'll talk about here in a second, got his first minutes and got a steal with a pass up to Darion. And in space, that's where LeBaron and Darion really thrive. And I thought that this game was really a perfect skill set for the 2 of those guys. LeBaron Philon was also my player to watch for this game, and I thought very similarly. When you think of Alabama, you think of a guy like Mark Sears, but Philon in general does a pretty good job when you're able to get in space and be able to create, and I thought that that's what this game was for Philon, and part of the reason why him and Darion were both able to have success. The guys I want to talk about next or the big guy I want to talk about next is Chris Youngblood, right? For those of you that have been listening to the pod or pay attention to Twitter or anything, Chris Youngblood, the transfer from South Florida, has been out this season. There was some thought that he may potentially play for that North Carolina game. He ends up sitting in that game. Alabama did not need him. Alabama wins pretty comfortably in that game. But we hear Chris Youngblood's going to be playing in this Creighton game. And when you hear that, for those of us that follow Nate Oates and pay attention to a lot of the press conferences, you're not sure if this is like a full-on minutes restriction, like he's not going to play more than 10 minutes. Is this somebody who's potentially ready to be back and you're going to play him less minutes because he's just getting into the flow, right? Like, how ready is he actually to play basketball? And I think that the minutes that Chris Youngblood put on the floor told you exactly what you need to know. And the answer is there was a bit of a minutes restriction, of course, but Youngblood still plays 16 minutes, right? He played the same number of minutes as Aiden Holloway. He played more minutes than Sherelle, Millette, and Diabate, right? I think part of that has to do with matchups, and part of that has to do with how Creighton plays basketball. But it's a situation where Chris Youngblood, at times in this game looked pretty solid, right? He had 2 steals, which is tied for the lead on the team. He did have an assist. He was pretty active on the rebounding standpoint. He only got 1, which is not as many as you'd like to see for the amount of minutes he played. But, it's not the end of the world, right? Like I did see where he had quite a few tip balls, trying to get it to other guys for rebounding. He took up quite a few shots from 3. And the thing that I think that impressed me the most about Chris Youngblood was how fast his trigger is from 3, right? When you think about a NATO style team, obviously the ability to take and make a lot of threes is pretty high up on what he considers important from an offensive standpoint, right? They talk about layups, free throws, and threes. And the thing with when we talked about Chris Youngblood is he's a career 40% guy, right? The last few seasons, he's been a 40% guy at Kennesaw State. Last season at USF, when he was the co-AAC Player of the Year, he was over 40%, right? So we know that he's a guy who can make a lot of shots. But the thing that impressed me is how fast he can get them up, right? When you think about some shooters, think about like an Aiden Sherrill, right? Aiden Sherrill has not shot, incredibly well this season from 3. But we know, from high school, from AAU, Aiden can make some shots. But if you pay attention, Aiden has to line them up, and the way he takes the shot, obviously a big guy versus a guard, completely different. But just this time in which it takes for him to take a shot and get into the flow is much different. The 3 that Chris Youngblood made was a hammer pass into the corner, and he caught it and put it up in fractions of a second, right? I really thought that he wasn't going to have time to put it up because of how quickly the defense closed out, right? And so for what that showed me for Chris Youngblood is that he's going to be somebody that is going to be crucial to have on the floor, obviously from a defensive standpoint with the steals and what we know Chris can be, but also from an offensive standpoint because somebody that can take a shot off the catch and be that efficient with that quick of a trigger in this style of offense is absolutely incredible, right? It's something that you can't exactly coach, right? It's in somebody's shot mechanics, it's in somebody's, how they play basketball, right? But the fact that Chris can take and make those shots so quickly is going to be a huge key to how Alabama plays offense, especially, like the one he made in this game. Like I said, we pass over to the corner, and even though the defense had a fairly good closeout, and in my opinion, probably closes out on most shooters because of how quickly they closed out, Chris was still able to get the shot up and make the shot, right? He obviously shows a propensity to be able to take them, right? He took 5 threes, which is tied for second most on the entire team. So that's something that's good to see, right? You want somebody when coming back from injury to feel like, hey, they're getting into the flow. They know where their role is going to be on this team. They know what they need to do. And it really felt like Chris was not, did he have some rust? Absolutely, right? This is his first game back. I'm not expecting him to be perfect. But the fact that he was able to be as successful as he was, helping on the defensive end, making the 3, he did also finish at the rim as well, right? It was a situation where I thought that, by and large, Chris was pretty good in the minutes that he gave. Is it going to be his best performance of the year? No, but you didn't need it to be, right? You just needed him to get back out there, get used to what he needs to do. And then the last guy we'll talk about, and, we'll save the quote-unquote best for last, is Mark Sears, right? A lot was said about Mark Sears over the last few games, that he, especially over Vegas, he was not shooting really well from 3, was not playing particularly well, had a lot of turnovers to assists, just was not the best Mark Sears that we've seen. And this was kind of the Mark Sears coming out party for this season, right? He ends up with 27 points, 4 of 7 from deep, 7 of 8 from the line, had 6 rebounds, 2 offensive, which again tied for second on the team. Aiden Sherrill was the only one with more, and he had 5, right? Aiden was really dominant on the glass. And then 4 assists, right? So leads the team in assists as well, to just 1 turnover, right? And that 1 turnover came at a bad time. It was near the end of the game. You don't love to see that because of the timing of the turnover, but a 4-to-1 assist to turnover ratio you will take all day, right? This really felt like Mark Sears was in control. At moments, you could just go to Mark and he was putting a shot up and he was going to make it, right? And that's what you like to see when you have an All-American or somebody that's, a potential All-American on the floor, is even though the opposing team is going to scheme to try to stop him, is that he, at moments, you can give him the ball and can either make a shot, get to the line, create for a teammate, and be successful on the floor, right? That's what you want to see out of your All-American. That's what you did see out of your All-American. He's the only guy on the team that plays over 30 minutes. He plays 34 minutes. And I think that all in all, the depth of this team is able to place its best when you have somebody like Mark that's able to distribute, right? Those assists would have been higher if it had been for some guys making some shots. And as I mentioned, if you want to look at this game at a whole, and the things that we need to take away from this game is, at moments, Alabama defended their absolute butts off in this game, right? There were some times which Creighton just made some really good shots. They have a couple of shot makers in McAndrew and Ashworth. McAndrew is an elite three-point shooter. He goes 5 of 8 from 3. And at 6'10", he's able to kind of get them up whenever. But the thing is that, in general, at times, like I said, Alabama was able to defend and, kind of play at will. If Alabama's able to make a few more threes in this game, and I have to expect that they're going to, 6 of 30 is not a NATO's team, especially due to the fact that quite a few of those shots were wide open, right? Those were high percentage looks, and from the people you want to take them. Grant Nelson goes 0 of 2. Jaron Stevenson 0 of 2. Darian Reed 0 of 2. Aiden Holloway, just went 5 of 6. Now he goes 0 of 4, right? I don't expect this to be the norm, but sometimes these kind of shooting nights happen. And the fact that you're able to beat a good team by 8, was up by 10 for the majority of this game. You're up by 10 on a team like this, win by 8 on a team like this on such a poor shooting night really says to the ceiling of this team, because I really think that on a average shooting night, because this was a very poor shooting night, but on an average shooting night, I think Alabama wins this game by almost 20 points. And that's not really a stretch. It wouldn't have shocked me if it had gotten more than that. There were a few moments in this game that Alabama was really blowing it open, and Creighton, to their credit, was able to withstand those runs and kind of slowly claw their way back. Alabama was up by 17 at one point in this game. And, again, Creighton cuts the lead to 6. And, it never really felt like Alabama was going to lose the game, but it definitely was getting like, ooh, this is a little close for comfort. Right? Now, it's tough to say what Creighton's going to be without Pop Isaacs. I think that's a major loss for them. But at the end of the day, Alabama gets a big win at home against a hated rival. If you know, you know. But, the fact that Creighton is able to win, or is able to, give Alabama the game, credit to them. But Alabama wins this game despite some, poor officiating, poor shooting, not their best night. First game with Chris Youngblood back in a week that graduation was in Coleman that morning, so they weren't able to shoot their normal shoot-around times on Thursday and Friday. Also weren't able to shoot before the game until right before tip, right? So there were things that kind of got the rhythm out of the norm for this game. But at the end of the day, Alabama wins the game. Alabama wins comfortably, and Alabama goes into kind of completes the difficult part of their non-conference slate. There are 3 games left in the non-conference slate, which is a step down in competition from where Alabama has been playing the last couple of games. So we'll talk about that here in just a second, and then we will get out of here. So as I mentioned, Alabama is done with the gauntlet of the non-conference slate. For reference, and we'll reference KenPom in a little bit because I know that a couple of people have asked me to do it, but Alabama's KenPom, rankings of the teams they've played this season, UNC Asheville's so far in last at like 189th in the country. Arkansas State's at 112, and they're the only 2 teams currently that Alabama has played outside of the top 100, right? Alabama wins both of those games fairly comfortably. Arkansas State played us well, but I think that has more to do with the coach on the sideline than it has to do with the team. I think Arkansas State's a really good team, but I do think that's because Brian Hodgson coached with Nate Oates for many years and knows how to play that style of team. Then you have McNeese State. That's Will Wade. Will Wade is as good a coach as possible. I think he slowed that game down and just kept the margin of victory that he wanted to kind of lose by, so to speak. Then Alabama, plays number 21 Purdue, 16 Illinois, 4 Houston, 76 Rutgers, 17 Oregon, 28 North Carolina, and 42 Creighton. Right, so the majority of the rest of the teams that Alabama has played have been top 75. The reason I bring these up is the next 3 games Alabama is going to face before they get into conference slate are the worst 3 teams they will have faced to this point. All 3 teams are outside of the top 100, and this next team in North Dakota is outside of the top 290. They're 295 currently in KenPom, right? Now, the question for some people is going to be, why are we playing North Dakota? And especially, why are we playing North Dakota at North Dakota, right? Seems kind of crazy. The answer is very simple. We did it for Grant Nelson, right? So if you look at this game and you say, why is Alabama playing North Dakota at North Dakota? We did it for Grant Nelson, right? The reason we played Creighton with the home and home is we wanted to be able to play in Omaha for Latrell Reitzel. If you look back to when we played in Canada, we did it for Charles Bediako. Funny enough, he wasn't there when we played the game. The plan was that he would be. But all these games get scheduled so that guys can kind of go back to their hometown, especially if it works out, right? Obviously, we're not going to do it if it's not possible, right? But if Nate Oates and the opposing coach can figure out something that makes sense for both teams, then it makes sense for us to schedule a home and home or a 2-for-1 or whatever, so that we can go play near one of our players' hometown and them be able to have their family there and, just kind of have a homecoming of sorts. And that's the reason why we're playing North Dakota, right? This is the worst team that we will play this season, right? It's also a good thing because we can work on some lineups. We can get Chris Youngblood and Houston Millette kind of into the flow of the offense a little more against not nearly as good of a defense as what they faced the last couple of weeks, right? It really is just what we need for the team, right? We can test out lineups. We can do what we need to do before you get into what is going to be an incredible SEC slate, right? For those of you that are unaware, the SEC is far and away the best conference in college basketball right now. Last I saw, they were 143-20 in non-conference right now. There's not a single team in the SEC with a losing record currently. I think South Carolina is the worst, quote-unquote, worst team in conference with 3 losses, and it's 7-3, right? This is an elite basketball conference, and I do expect that, it will be a battle every game out on the floor, right? When we're talking about the KenPom numbers, currently the worst ranked team in the SEC per KenPom is 68th, right? Take this with a grain of salt. It's still December. KenPom numbers are not the end of the world, but, this just gives you a reference as to what we're looking at for the rest of the season, right? I do expect these numbers to change. I do expect they're, probably to be an SEC team, get higher than that as the season goes along, but that's where the numbers sit today as of December the 15th, right? Is that the worst SEC team currently ranked is 68th, and that's just insane. So, what do I want to see as it comes through these next 3 games? And as I said, we're going to break down a little bit of North Dakota. We'll talk about the game a little bit, but I don't want to have this be a breakdown of just the North Dakota game. I think this should be an idea as to what we need to know, what I want to see for North Dakota, Kent State, and South Dakota State, right? Because I think in general, all 3 of these games, I personally want to see kind of the same thing, right? I want to see Nate Oates figure out some rotations because now you have your full lineup, right? Anyone who is going to be eligible to play this season is now, able to play, right? Not to say Chris Youngblood may not be on a little bit of a minutes restriction with some of these games. He still may be. But, especially for that South Dakota State game, you got a week off in between Kent State and South Dakota State. So I think because of how these games are spread out, I do think that we're going to have some time to get some guys some rest. And that, by that South Dakota State game, we're going to have a pretty good idea, and especially before Oklahoma, again, having another week in between, we're going to have a pretty good idea as to what our lineups need to be and the health of our lineups, right? Because I think that in general, our guys are pretty healthy right now. Obviously, with the exception of Latrell, it's going to be out for the season. But I think our guys are healthy, and that is going to have, Nate Oates with the ability to decide, hey, this is in this type of game with this style of play. I need to play Mo D, X number of minutes, and Aiden Sherrill X number of minutes, if they're playing well, right? Or maybe in this kind of game, we want to have Houston Millette play more because you need an extra 3-point shooter, and you're not looking for as much of a big body like an Aiden Sherrill, or a Mo Diabate, a more physical guy, right? So it's really, that's what I'm looking for as it comes to those games, right? I want to see Nate Oates determining what lineups make more sense. So far this season, he's really been using a huge percentage of his lineup, right? In this last game, every scholarship player that's eligible to play and is not injured, so everybody not named Latrell is playing this season, right? So he had 11 guys. I think that rotation is not, realistic. I think that most games you're going to want to see like 8 to 9 guys, maybe 10, in a specific instance, like if somebody fouls out or you need somebody for like a very short instance, right? I think that we need to shrink the lineup just slightly, right? And it needs to be on a per game basis, right? It seems like we did that a little bit in this Creighton game because Mo Diabate, only played 4 minutes. Houston Millette only played 8 minutes, right? But this is a game where I think that just in general, I think that the flow of Nate Oates' system works better when people have a little bit more time, right? If they can't really get into the speed and pace at which we play, I think that I understand the fresh bodies element, right? We're getting fresh bodies out there so that we're able to keep the pace up the whole time. But I do think there is kind of a mix and match of, yes, you're getting fresh bodies out there, but you're also losing the ability for them to get into the flow of the offense, right? Or the flow of the defense, quite frankly, right? So that's something that I would like to see with these next few games is if we can potentially like shrink the roster just slightly. And again, I'm not expecting this to mean like, hey, one guy gets completely pushed out of the roster. But for example, if we're going to look at 2 guys, you could look at like a Mo D and a Houston Millette, right? I think their skill sets are completely different, and I think that the type of game in which they can be successful is completely different, right? I think that if you're looking at a game like a Houston, right, obviously a really big game for a guy like Mo D, right? That is the perfect style game for him. Then if you look at the game like North Carolina, right, the first game that we have Houston Millette play, that's a really good game for Houston because it was a very fast-paced game, a very in-the-flow game. There's some rhythm threes to be gotten, right, in transition. That's 2 perfect styles for the way these 2 guys play. One plays much more in the flow, one plays more gritty and physical. And so I think that's, those are 2 guys that it would not surprise me if their roles boosted in the games in which they're going to be super helpful and shrunk in the games in which they're not, right? Just so that we can make sure that the lineups kind of flow and make sense together, right? Especially as you're getting a guy like Chris Youngblood that, from what I can tell, is going to be very successful. I think that what he does and what Alabama needs, he's going to be able to bring to us, right? So that is something I would like to see for these next few games is Alabama just being able to look at what's going to be successful and, build the lineups as it relates to that. Also, be able to get guys rest, right? Mark Sears played over 30 minutes in this game, and it was great that he did, right? But I don't think that in these next 3 games, we need to be playing guys over 30, right? If it's 30, 31, 32 maybe, I'm okay with that, right? But I think that needs to be the hard cap for most of these games because I think that working on the lineups and getting guys rest as it goes and not just pushing the lineups like you had to do last season, right? Because when Latrell got injured last season, you had guys like Aaron Estrada and Mark Sears playing 40 minutes, right? Obviously, we have more guards this year, so we're not going to have to do that. But I just think that when we had fresh legs last season, you saw a lot better Alabama team just due to the speed in which we play. So, again, I would like to see us, even on the top end, right, shrink the minutes, make sure nobody's going more than like 31, ideally no more than 30, right? But no more than 31, 32 minutes max. And then also on the bottom end, let's see, in some games, let's make sure that everybody, in this North Dakota game, I would expect that most people get some minutes, right, as he plays around with rosters because I think you're going to be able to. But then in the next 2 games, again, let's see what's successful. Let's see what works. Let's get Chris into the flow of the offense. Let's get Houston into the flow of the offense. And let's see what Alabama can do as they get ready for a gauntlet of an SEC stretch. right? So that's the last thing I wanted to talk about. Like I said, I know it's not an exact breakdown as it comes to North Dakota. I didn't want to, bore you guys with breaking down a team that currently sits at 4-7 and has the 331st ranked defense in the country. Spoiler alert, I think Alabama's going to win and probably win comfortably, even though it's at North Dakota, right? I do think that Alabama's going to have a lot of success in this game. I think Alabama's just got athletes that are just better than anybody North Dakota State's going to, or North Dakota, I'm sorry, is going to be able to throw at them. So I do think that Alabama is going to be successful in this game, and that's no surprise. So, I just didn't think it made sense for me to break down this specific game just due to what I think is going to happen. So I will do a bit of a breakdown, as I said, next week after this game so that I can make sure everybody's aware, like, hey, this is what I look forward for the next 2 games. And then, like I said, the schedule may shake up just a little bit because I will be out of town and I'm not sure how the recording setup is going to be able to go. If you do follow me over on Twitter, I will be putting out threads for all of the games. I'm going to try to type those up as I have some time so that I just have those ready to put out whenever the game comes up. I can put those threads out on the Twitter feed that morning of the game, right? So just follow me over on Twitter if you don't already. I will give breakdowns of like what players to watch for opposing teams, who we need to watch for the Alabama team, what my prediction is, whether it be the glass or where I think either team is going to be successful, and then my prediction, right? So follow me over on Twitter for those. Those are going to come out as they always do. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching the podcast and subscribing to the channel. I really appreciate it, and I will catch you in the next episode. Peace.